Okay, thank you very much, Fiona, and everyone. Morada to everyone. I have actually written my talk, so it's available if you want. I said to Fiona I'd send it to her. Well, that's if you want it. And I was really delighted about this invitation. I'd hoped we'd been on Anglesey, which I know reasonably well. Instead, we're on Planet Zoom, and we've just had an illustration of the difference. I don't need to tell you that Wales is, again, seriously interesting on food, and I want to comment about that. Look at what we've had this week, last week, the new Plaid Labour Agreement. Food is a sub-theme. If you look across the agreement, which I have, and I'm sure some of you have, it pops up everywhere: school food, poverty, trees, etc. Then on page 6, I quote, develop a community food strategy to encourage the production and supply of locally sourced food in Wales. Well, there's a lot can be hung on that. But we also have the Conservative opposition, Peter Fox, MS, his very interesting food brackets, Wales brackets bill, which has had backing from Senedd, including support from Labour. And so you've got basically the beginnings of something very interesting, if not a consensus, at least a coherence beginning to emerge. We've got in Wales very strong civil society voice beyond the old, if you like, Farmers Union of Wales and National Farmers Union of Wales type stuff. We've got this gathering, which I've watched grow in the 3 years in difficult circumstances. We've got the Food Policy Alliance, Cymru. We've got the extraordinary interest of WWF Cymru. We've got Food Sense Wales. You've got hugely important and vibrant NGOs emerging everywhere. Something new is underway about food in Wales, I think, beyond the romantic old agricultural appeal. And that's what I want to address in this talk. I'm going to make 8 points. My first point is a very big question. What's the point of food and farming? I don't ask this question lightly. A Cabinet Office civil servant in London said to me once, I quote, we don't need food production in the UK. We can buy food on the world markets. Just think about that. His thinking then, this was a few years ago, is exactly what has resurfaced in right-wing politics. It was actually under the last Labour administration that was said to me. But we see that already shaping the thinking in Whitehall, the reluctance and indeed refusal to put food into the English Agriculture Act. You may say, well, that's England, but that shapes what happens across the UK, particularly with Brexit. The refusal to specify in the Dimbleby National Food Strategy, a Part 2 report, that food security is a policy motive. They're ducking it for understandable reasons because they've really been looking for trade issues. You could have a land policy which delivered biodiversity gains, soil management improvement, water sequestration, climate change resilience, without it being a food policy. But this would be mad, given the UK left the EU, where we get 30 to 40% of our food, and mad, given the importance of geopolitics at the moment, which I'll talk about. This uncertainty coming from London is very, very dangerous, I think. And I don't say that lightly. I mean dangerous politically. Not today, but in the next few years, next coming time. We've got to, I think, question that drift. And I think Wales is poised to take a lead on that and is indeed beginning to. Let's remind ourselves what the Wales food system is. 21.35 billion turnover pre-COVID, 27,000 enterprises, mostly small, exports of only 0.5 million actually, pounds that is, so very small actually, 0.5 billion, and about 230,000 jobs in food, but that's 17% of Wales's jobs. That's not just the farming, that's on to hospitality, and that's where bulk starts kicking in. Many in SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprise. So to answer my own question for us, for discussion, what's the point of food and farming? I have 3 answers. Firstly, a decent country would set out to feed all of its people sustainably. That's a tricky word. In other words, healthily, protecting ecosystems with social resilience. key to think about the people by producing as much of what is needed from its own resources, as long as that's sustainable. So we say no to growing bananas on Anglesey in nuclear-powered greenhouses, but we say yes to growing a vast range of fruit and vegetables sustainably. And that theme of horticulture, I really welcome in this conference. And I'm chairing the session about the really amazing 1,200 acres project, Monmouth and Brecon. The second reason for the point of food and farming is that I think food is part of what we now call the Manchester Schools term, part of the foundational economy. In other words, the infrastructure of a good culture. And we've got to redesign, I think, and that's the tricky bit. And I think you're beginning that in Wales, we're beginning that, but not yet there. We've got to redesign institutions to deliver that. And the third answer to what's the point of food and farming is that we've got to actually enshrine all of this in law. There's no point having a waffling discussion or talking to ourselves over pints of beer or wine or fruit juice or whatever, unless it's in law. We've got to link the food economy's different goals to other goals: climate change, biodiversity loss, decent jobs, improved health. And don't let's forget, food is ultimately about pleasure too. The point we have to have, and this conference is about, as I understand it, is how can this be done and by whom? Point number two, these are very tricky times for such food ambition, but we can inject and bridge food realism and political realism into and alongside those food ambitions. Brexit has not given clarity. We can't forget that we are in a post-Brexit time. And that's why the Conservative government in London is constantly trying to go back to that and rerun the old arguments. I heard an ex-Tory minister last week say in a big meeting I was at too, saying, why do they keep rerunning this? They've got what they wanted, now what? And the answer is they don't quite know what they want. And there was silence about food and food consumption and many of the issues that this conference is about at COP26. And there were good things at COP26, I don't want to downplay that, but there was a gaping hole, nothing about food consumption. And yet food consumption accounts for 24, depends how you calculate it, % of all greenhouse gas emissions. So the UK settlement, and I use that word advisedly, the unwritten contract between the people, land, and society is in some disarray. We still don't know quite what it is. The London government is zigzagging, and that makes life very difficult. And all of this is in the context where geopolitics are tricky to be very, very calm about it. Just think gas and the fact that Britain has very little storage. On mainland Europe, countries have much bigger storage. Look at the politics that's emerged. China versus USA tensions rubbling at the moment, and Britain's chumped for going for nuclear submarines, undermining the links with France, but we get our food comes through France. East-West tensions, Russia versus the EU, intra-EU relations, the old splits of what I call is called the Visegrad groups, the Poland's, Hungary's, Bulgaria's, the Eastern Europe versus the Western Europe. There's a retilting of the world within which food comes from. We're in an era of runaway technologies. Those who know my work, I'm extremely interested in the way in which the food system has been brilliantly high-tech, just-in-time systems, entirely reliant on things where the new tensions and the politics, and indeed warfare, will and is already beginning to happen. We're in an era of big data, AI, hypersonics, quantum computing, and biotech. I was at a NATO meeting last week, believe it or not, because I'm very interested in the issue of food defense. And all of these things were seen as very, very, very critical for the politics of Europe ahead. And Britain's now an outlier on that, very dangerously so, with a weak army, weak military, actually. If you look at it, again, look at that in my Feeding Britain, if you want to see a summary of that. We couldn't protect our food supply chains if we wanted to. So Europe and the UK as this offshore wing, pretending it's not part of Europe, are caught between China and the USA on clouds. And I think the answer, what we're doing in Wales, what you're doing in Wales, is to try and carve out a better food system that isn't dependent upon the high-tech cloud, here we are in Zoom world, but on people and skills on Earth. The ambition for Wales, I think, is not about chasing high technology economies, but is getting the agri-food rights, correct as the basics of a decent society. I repeat, feeding people well, providing decent jobs, and valuing labor and nature in circular economies. Point number 3, this issue of food security and food sustainability and food defense. The only answer to food security is to have a sustainable food system. And that has to be our argument. Don't listen to the voices who say it's all high tech. It's about sustainability. We have to argue, what is that? What do we mean by that? It's not just the environment. It's people and the environment. Food is part of the infrastructure, the foundational economy, the Manchester School. If you haven't read them, read them. A lot of thinking. We inherit much from the past, from Victorians onwards. Roads, small farms, water, hygiene, skills. But we're going to require in the future, this very dynamic and tricky world we're now in, we're going to have to be more adaptable while building social cohesion, which isn't there. Food should be and could be part of this foundational economy, the social infrastructure that makes society civilized to live in. Why? Because if we address the problem of ecological public health, what's a good diet? A sustainable diet from sustainable food system. Is that embedded water? Do we take that seriously? Wales thinks it's full of water. Actually, the importation of embedded water in the food that feeds people in Wales is frankly a new imperialism. And that applies to Britain generally. Again, have a look at the sections on that in my Feeding Britain book. A food foundational economy would address these issues of where and how food is produced, the hidden ingredients in it, not just the embedded water or carbon or soil or biodiversity loss, but also the hidden labor, the degradation of labor in the food system in imported foods is something that's extremely important to get a grip around. And I've argued elsewhere, this is why we need a civil food defense and what the National Infrastructure Commission, and I bet most people on this call have never even heard of the National Infrastructure Commission. This is a critical body, a rare body in the British state, which is the UK state, which is looking 50 years ahead. And it's looking at what will happen if sea rises happen, what will happen to the road infrastructure without thinking about the food infrastructure, as though those are separate matters. I think what this means is rethinking urban and rural relations. A resilient food system is about reconnecting land and people via healthy, sustainable diets. And one way in, of course, is via gardening. It's not just about farming, it's about getting everyone to take their food seriously. The biggest link of all, actually, the potential is gardening. Point number 4, food democracy in a multi-level world. We live in a multi-level world, local to global, and all of those levels have different intervention points of potential to help Wales raise the game. But what we've had over the last 50 years is a long-term drift up the levels. A lot of the criticisms of the European Union, it was unaccountable. It wasn't actually, we were part of it and big players in it, but that's by the by, that's the past. But look at where we are, the brilliant slogan of taking back control. What have we seen? Morrison's, one of the big 3 that feeds Wales, sold off to private equity. Where's the leverage there? Where's the leverage that can counter that? The space, I think, is now opening to wrench down the taking back control for all the pathetic rhetoric of it. We're seeing it come apart in all sorts of ways in the London government, makes the London government very nervous. And Wales can exploit that. Wales has partial devolution. It could and should, and I think is beginning to, press the local button more. In other words, decentralize not just from London to Cardiff, but decentralize within Wales. And we need to be more upfront, I think, about the South, Mid and North Wales separations, and to argue more that a bioregional approach enables those divisions in Wales, the natural divisions, the geographical divisions, to actually become a source of strength and source of diversity as strength. And I think that's why projects like the Monmouth 1200 are so important. The key challenge here is to write and rewrite the rules of engagement. And I think the Labour-Clyde agreement, and I think the opportunities around the Food Wales bill, Peter Fox's bill, are very important opportunities around which we should rally from the 2020s, the goals, I think, must include this social and political dimension of re-democratizing the food system, relocalizing appropriately, encourage eating within planetary boundaries. And it grieves me to see Wales surrounded on three sides by seas to basically deal with its fishing and seafood industries so poorly, if I'm really honest. While rebuilding culinary culture. That's the way to do it. The French show us how to do it. And what does happen? Wales deals badly with exporting its seafood. Decision-making has got to address this issue of regional food democracy. I would like to see, personally, I'd like to see regional food committees, regional food policy councils emerging across Wales as appropriate. Point number 5. People have to be at the heart of this land and food regeneration. Wales has long been proud of its landscape and holdings, its radical political traditions, its opposition to England. There is a strong civil society renaissance. Remember CAT, Centre for Alternative Technology, being founded in 1973, injecting this radical green thinking around energy. At the Abergavenny Food Festival, resuscitating the notion of culture as agriculture. Brilliant thinking in the late 20th century, 1999 actually. And the new groups like Our Food 1200, I keep mentioning. I think the next stage surely must be about focusing more in Wales on capacities and skills. Part of Wales's reluctance to shift its food system has been a desire to protect the old heritage, the small upland farms, places of huge skill. Let's not forget that. The knowledge passed down on and through generations, really important and rich, but we need new skills. And I've argued elsewhere in my Feeding Britain book that we need new colleges of agri-food. I think CAT is becoming that actually with the higher education work it's doing. We've got to have formal goal under in the Food Wales bill. I would suggest strongly that a proposal to create new colleges of agri-food from existing institutions, and where they're not there, create new institutions. But they must be centrally about linking town and country. They mustn't just be rural colleges, again, highlighting the separation of the urban rural. This is ludicrous because food is the connection between the rural and the urban. And we're a majority. Wales is a majority urbanized country. In the 19th century, those colleges of agriculture that were set up, basically they've been dissipated in all sorts of ways. They've been turned into and roped into universities. There's an opportunity for a relivening of that tradition. In the 20th century, we had the National Agricultural Advisory Services that turned in 1971 into ADAS, the Agricultural Development Advisory Service, but it was privatized in 1996. It's just become another. In the 20th century, we've got to have escalators in town to town. But I think what that means is trying to address short chains skills. How can we get urban people interested in horticulture to be able to work on the land? And I think the answer to that is it has to be peri-urban or fringe farming, as the excellent NGO Sustain calls it, around the towns. We've got to rethink those sort of arguments. Point number 6, this is basically the term bioregionalism. Thinking biologically about the region, thinking about food within the biosphere as the region. The Conservative government keeps trumpeting that Britain is now global Britain. We're somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, or is it on the equator, or is it a neo-imperial Britain, or is it buccaneering Britain? We're not quite sure, and I don't think they know. Indeed, the Conservatives are completely split about that, but that's their problem. Our problem is that has no coherence, given us no coherence. We have, on the one hand, our friends in Europe, they feed us, and on the other hand, knifing France on nuclear submarines to Australia, silence on Morrison's being sold off to a US hedge fund. I was in a supermarket, indeed Morrison's on Anglesey recently, and the checkout person was really, really upset and worried about that, and rightly so. The London government is desperate for a US trade deal, but it's frankly going to be entirely dependent on how they manage the Northern Ireland Protocol. And one sees that in the flow of traffic, the lorry traffic coming through the A5, the A55 through to Holyhead. And so it's very, very important for Wales to realize this is its politics. It's not somewhere else, or blame it on London. But there is space to carve out an ethos of bioregional Britain and bioregional Wales and bioregionality within Wales. This has to be done to build the diversity, which is the only solution to creating some sort of adaptability for climate change. We don't fully know. We've got a pretty good picture from the science about what sea rises and climate change is going to do, but it's going to pose enormous social stresses within Wales, not just abroad. This is ultimately a challenge to ecology and how we think, in Darwin's wonderful phrase, about the web of life. And we people are wrecking the web of life. Ecology isn't just out there, nature, greenery, it's how we eat and how we produce our food. So I see bioregionalism as a term, as an argument, as a way to integrate diverse aspects of the political economy. And I've said already, I think Wales is on the way to addressing that. But a key test for that, for me, is whether it's going to, Wales is going to develop an appropriate horticulture. How can it develop food production, other than just the romance of sheep and cattle on the uplands, in a world where we have to plant more trees, biodiverse trees, if we follow the rhetoric of what was talked properly about at Glasgow in COP26, the slogan being 30 and 30, to have 30% tree cover by 2030. Now, Britain was already the worst tree cover of Europe compared to, say, Germany or France, indeed. Indeed, London, the city where I'm talking to you from, has a bigger tree cover than Britain on average. Bioregionalism, I think, is emerging in Wales, but it needs to be out and proud, is how I've written it here. Point number 7. This is critical. This requires us to face and engage with consumers. Consumers, I'm always saying it, and I speak as someone who has worked very closely with the consumer movement worldwide, arguing the ecological public health case from 30 years ago and actually getting frozen out of the mainstream value for money consumer movement at the time, but that's over now. They get it. Consumers, when they are shown the data about climate change, and I was one of the witnesses to the Climate Assembly of the Select Committee, 6 select committees came together, a wonderful TV program about it, by the way, on the BBC, if you look for it, called Climate Change versus the People. But actually, Wales has got a problem, and has a long problem of consumption over health. I first started coming again, other than holidays, to my Welsh family, to Wales over Heartbeat Wales, the catastrophic cardiovascular disease incidence in Wales in the 1980s. Today, even the latest data about Wales, only 25% of adults in Wales eat 5 a day of fruit and vegetables. 61%, that's 2/3 of Wales, is overweight or obese. 25% of Wales is obese. I mean, that is a shocking indictment of where we are in terms of the mismatch between how we live and what we're doing and how we buy and consume. Now, this is not blaming anyone for that. It's just saying we have the indicators aren't just serious about the land or soil. They're about what we eat and how we live and how we expend energy, in which we're all affected. Basically, almost all of Britain is overweight. There's been a drift, and we have to understand in the public health position and arguments, and certainly I'm involved in public health because I work a lot on public health and food, is about the social determinants that means it's totally normal to be overweight. There's no blame about it at all. We've created societies to guarantee populations to gradually get more overweight. And this means a distortion is going on back to the Darwinian position of where we are in our ecological needs. Citizens' juries show time and time again when people see the data, the complexity that we discuss in conferences like this, they say, why weren't we told? And that was the big message of the Climate Assembly. And it's the big message of almost every citizens jury that looks at this, which the consumer organization, I was an advisor to it in the 2010s, ran 4 citizens juries. And the Wales citizens jury showed that just like that. Why weren't we told? Why weren't we helped? And I think the WWF Cymru report, for example, recently done with Cardiff University, is really good on that point. And I think Wales could, in the food bill, it could take a leadership and have what I call omni-labels. In other words, have sustainability labeling of food, not just the health and the nutrition, the ingredients, but environmental information. The companies know it. It's easy enough to calculate. It's what universities and colleges could help people to do and small firms to do, and social information. And if you say that's too complicated, because I started arguing this 15 years ago, in various locations, it was said too complicated. We don't know how to do it. We do now. And every phone can read QR codes. If we can do it for the NHS and COVID, we can do it for food system. Why do it for labeling? Well, consumers don't use labels that much, but it sends enormous signals back through the supply chain and encourages reformulation. And it just shifts the dial, very importantly. Last point. All of this requires exactly what this conference is about, renewing organizations and arguing and developing for better institutions and, when appropriate, new institutions. Wales and the UK are not alone in these struggles. They are struggles. It's complicated. We've had a post-Second World model of food production and consumption, which has run out of steam. It's no longer appropriate. Food is part of the problem of the planet, part of the problem of Wales, but it should be also part of the solution. And that is why I think we're in a good place now, because we're beginning to realize that. You can't blame Europe for where we are. This is us. This is a post-imperial country, which still assumes other people are going to feed it. Why? Why should we assume that? As the civil servant has said, we don't need farmers. We can buy food on the open market, Tim. I nearly went bonkers. There have been long fights to try and improve the food system in Britain, in which Wales has played a major part in all sorts of ways. And we've got to recognize that today, look at the drag of food poverty and low income on both on health, the rising gap between rich and poor again, within Wales and between regions of the UK. The food bank's era of welfare is failing. Charity does not work. It's a sticking plaster, and everyone in that world knows that's the case. But here, in conferences like this, we have an opportunity to try and encourage and confirm and support local food committees, partnerships developing, reinvigorating the role of city councils, county councils, linking and engaging civil society and food supply chains. I have argued, again, elsewhere, the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, which covers Wales, was set up to try and address this. But the resilience forums aren't doing that, frankly. And I'm on the London Food Board for the Mayor of London, and indeed was under the previous Mayor, Boris Johnson. But I spent 2 years in the London Food Board, I can say, I'm not breaking any confidences, trying to get the London Food Board to work together with the Resilience Forum to plan for food emergencies. And then when the COVID hit, some of that thinking was very useful in the reaction of the Mayor and the Greater London Authority, and in some cities that applied too, but really they didn't act as civil protection bodies, which is what they should be. But I think there are opportunities, is my point. Wherever you are in Wales, there are opportunities to get together with other people and try to re-democratize and build appropriate institutions which address the food problem and take food to the relevant democratic processes, breathe life and pressure into those processes. So what I've done to conclude in this talk is no more than sketch what you all know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Everyone I know of the food world in Wales is engaging with bits of this picture, and some with all of it. My central argument and purpose, and why I was very honored to be asked and proud to do it and to think about it, was to do no more than to encourage this and to say more, harder, quicker. We have to do that. Food has to be seen as part of national infrastructure, whether you define the nation as the UK or Britain or Wales or North Wales or Anglesey or the Gower, however your framework in a multi-level food world, it's the foundational economy, student. And those roles must be and goals must be enshrined in the law. And wow, what an opportunity the Food Wales Bill is, and the Applied Labour Agreement is, and the vibrancy of conferences like this are. All of that shows us that food is not just about land use, but about the end of supply chains too. It's the food system, stupid. It's creaking, and we've got a lot to do, and we know a lot about what to do, and we've just got to carry on getting on with it, but fast. Thank you. Back to you, Fiona.
So thank you, Tim, for that interesting and very complicated, but simple, really, if you take a bigger step back than perhaps some of the stakeholders are doing and have been doing in the last few decades. We need to think about the bigger picture and about what the question I would just like to ask you very quickly before we go on to the audience, if people have their hands up. I've also mentioned that you are here chairing the next session or the next session after that. So I'm hoping to keep you with us as long as possible during the day today. But there might be a chance for a general, more open discussion about several different strands that you haven't had time to follow up here. You mentioned the taking control, and you mentioned about making, helping Wales to raise and up the game. So can I just ask a very cheeky question? What messages do we need to get out from this conference, and who needs to hear those messages?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that, well, I've tried to answer your question in my talk, actually, Fiona, which is, I think the gods are on our side, actually. We've got this new Labour Applied Agreement. We've got the Food Wales Bill from a Conservative opposition. So at the Senedd level, there is a golden opportunity. So that needs to be organised for. I see that as not something just to be left to everyone else. I don't know, it's not for me to say, but I don't know, Fiona, whether there is an organisation that can be spawned from this to keep a spotlight on and to feed in from civil society. Food Policy Alliance, Cymru, is the obvious one to do that, and the alliance that represents. So that's the first answer. The second, I think, so that's very practical and doable now. The second answer, I think, is trickier. Wales is, well, communication within Wales by transport is very tricky. We don't need to go there, but it's possible. The one thing that COVID has done is show us, so even up a mountainside, it is possible to have connection of some sort via the Zooms and all these platforms. There has to be an attempt to try and get, at whatever level of the local food organizations, bringing together different partnerships. Some of those can be done by progressive county councils, by town councils and so on. Some just maybe be people who already know each other. But I think to open that up and to present oneself and present yourself as a presence is what is critical. And that, I think, is, well, I'm a university man, so I would say this. The critical thing is to be thinking about young people. And talking with Fiona, one of the many reasons she and I were very sorry this couldn't be in Anglesey, she had geared up some lovely things, bringing in the young farmers of Anglesey and so on. And that's really important, not just to talk to ourselves as right-on people or people of a particular politics or particular interests, but to actually broaden it. Food democracy, as I first argued the term and indeed invented it 30 years ago, was about bringing together the diversity of people and interests, while recognizing there are some serious differences of position within that. But unless we have those local organizations to address food and to bring together those interests, I think if we haven't got those, that's a priority to focus on. So to summarize my answer to your question, the Senedd politics in the next year is really important to get engaged with, and that must be dealt with. Every single bit of that bill, when it comes, must be something that can win a majority and reflects what conferences like this think. And secondly, local organizations are so critical, and they're there often with just needing a bit of oomph behind them and a bit of a vision for them. And that's what I was trying to do. Say, what's the point of, say, an organization in Northeast Wales? What's the point of it? Well, the answer is to try and carve out what would a bioregional food system look like. Just every time I go along that North Wales plain between the sea and the mountains, I think of how that used to feed the people in the villages, and the villages and the fishing used to feed the people. That connection has been distorted and turned into a motorway one of giant hypermarkets. We've got to rethink that, basically. That's almost certainly what we've got to do.
Right, diolch yn fawr iawn. Well, I don't see any questions directly in the chat, excuse me, or on any of your screens. So I'm going to have to bring this really interesting session to a close I gael y sesiwn yma. Ond wrth gwrs mae'r drafodaeth yma'n parhau. Byddwn ni'n edrych ar y strategaeth fwyd gymunedol yn y sesiwn nesaf. Discussion will continue. In the next session, we'll be looking at the community food strategy and how that can also work from bottom up through local authorities and community social enterprises to try and address some of these challenges that Tim has mentioned. So, diolch yn fawr iawn, Tim. Fi'n gwybod bod gennych chi gysylltiadau hanesyddol personol gyda Môn Mam Cymru. So your connections, which are very personal and family connections to Anglesey, the mother, in terms of feeding Wales, is an important one for you. And we're very glad and lucky and grateful to have you this morning to start our conference.